Okay, a fundamental fork in the road. You suffer an indignity, even the brutality of being mistreated as a newbie. You've just joined an organization. You're at the bottom of the totem pole. People treat you shabbily. So what do you do once the time goes by and now you have seniority? Do you turn around and abuse those who come along after you? Or do you say, nobody should have to go through what I did, and so now that I have some authority, I'll use it to denounce cruel traditions and work to change the system? It's a fundamental separating of different kinds of people, a kind of binary diagnostic tool, if you like. There are loads of examples where people have the chance to do this as they rise in the hierarchy, from high school sports teams to college fraternities to the military. But here's one that I think is particularly interesting. Medical students and junior residents are put on the spot during patient rounds often. It's called pimping, when the instructor fires off hard questions at them about anatomy or diagnostic protocols or surgical procedures or something. It's defended, as it's defended like other forms of humiliation and bullying and hazing and punishment. Keeps them on their toes. It shows them, business. It toughens them up for when other people will abuse them later. And of course, that old chestnut, I suffered through it, why shouldn't they? Now, children in school are rarely questioned with that kind of ferocity, but they are often questioned when they don't want to give an answer. So that raises similar concerns, both morally and pedagogically, with particular urgency because they're younger. Should teachers call on students who haven't indicated they want to talk, and sometimes have indicated tacitly they don't want to talk? That's our topic today. Is cold calling ever justified? And conversely, for those kids who do want to say something, how do we decide who speaks when? Is there an alternative to the traditional model with kids raising their hands and waiting for the teacher to call on them? That's right now on Cone Zone. I'm Alfie Cone. My view is that cold calling is repugnant. Its message is, you'd rather not contribute to this discussion we're having right now, but I don't care about your preference, and I'll use my power to force you to contribute. If that's not disrespectful, then the word disrespectful has no meaning. Also, it harms everybody. It's sort of like when kids are forcibly isolated, sent to a timeout area in front of the whole class. Obviously insulting and demeaning to the kid who's the victim of that kind of practice. But it also sets an example. The other kids who are watching are thinking, this could be me next time, and they feel less safe. I think that's the case with cold calling as well. I'm almost tempted to ask a teacher who engages in a practice like this, what if an administrator at a faculty meeting did this to you, or a speaker at a workshop? Except that's really not the right question to ask, because there are some teachers who are quite comfortable in the spotlight and wouldn't mind. The point is, a lot of adults, and even more kids, do mind. Perspective taking is not about imagining our reaction in their situation. It's about imagining the point of view of this particular person, in this case, the child who would rather not speak. So a few years ago, I posted a critical remark along those lines about the idea of cold calling and got a lot of replies. And they basically fell into three groups. So the first group of people responding basically said, yes, amen. One person said, that's a great way to shame a kid. Somebody else said, too many teachers actually believe it's a trait of a good teacher that they can make people participate. Someone else said it's similar to using grades as coercion. It's especially obnoxious to call on a student, which basically means call out a student whom the teacher believes wasn't paying attention. All right, that's the first group of people, right on. Second group of people asked, well, is it always objectionable to call on kids whose hands aren't raised? One person said, it depends on how it's done, doesn't it? If the relationship is good and it's a gentle invitation to comment, that could be respectful, no? Somebody else said, how about if we create a climate where children feel happy and confident to raise their hands instead? Okay, fair enough. A smiling, gentle invitation. A teacher might say, Chris, I notice you haven't spoken for a while. Would you like to chime in here? And we also offer periodic reassurances that anybody can choose to pass at any time and say, no, thank you. That's completely different from a non-negotiable demand that everybody has to answer when they're pimped. Plus, as is almost always the case, and you've heard different variations of this theme on other episodes of this podcast, the question is not just how we're doing it, it's why we're doing it. As always, don't just focus on behavior. If you want to support reticent kids in being able to speak up, especially when you see a thought that seems to flicker across their faces, that's one thing. But using your power to create a classroom driven by fear, that's something else. You better be prepared because you never know when I'm going to call on you. That's an unsafe classroom. That's borderline abusive. But no matter how awful that latter scenario, that latter motive might be for kids, there are always adults who manage to rationalize it in terms of accountability, which ironically is the same word that policymakers often invoke to justify imposing their do-it-my-way or suffer version of school reform on teachers. Why would teachers ever treat kids that way? Another euphemism for when kids are coerced into talking is engagement. The kids are engaged in the lesson. Again, to frame it that way is to say that the goal is to produce a certain behavior that you can observe. It has nothing to do with the student's experience, the student's inner life. That's irrelevant. Mandating student responses, using your control to do that, is often part of a more general approach to instruction that's militaristic, the kind you see in those awful no excuses charter schools, which is part of what Martin Haberman called the pedagogy of poverty. The kind of classroom that's about memorizing facts and practicing skills and obeying authority. You'll talk whenever I demand that you do so, training kids to perform on command, like SEALs, is much more consistent with a bunch o' facts curriculum than it is with one that's rooted in inquiry and meaning. It's often all of a package, the kind of place where we're just putting kids through their paces, where we're making them acquire facts and skills on our schedule, mostly so we can raise test scores, not so we can improve learning, let alone interest in learning. That's all goes together. There's a really big difference between trying to elicit participation in a thoughtful, open-ended discussion and calling out the short questions that have clear, right answers and demanding that kids spit out those answers in front of their peers. You can observe classrooms like this no excuses model. There's a lot of stomach-turning examples of it on YouTube if you really want to watch something that's more abusive than educative. But pressuring kids to contribute, you'll quickly figure out when they're not ready, meshes very well with other disturbing values and practices. What's kind of interesting and kind of sad is when that's not the case. When you've got teachers who are the opposite of abusive, who are genuinely caring people with a real commitment to meaningful learning. You know, they're uncomfortable with a fact-based curriculum. They don't use rewards and punishments to manipulate kids. And yet, they think nothing of putting kids on the spot by saying, okay, and then they call on a kid who's not interested in talking. Those teachers really need, I think, to confront the inconsistency. They're giving with one hand in terms of the richness of the curriculum, and then taking it away with the other hand by making kids talk when they don't want to. You see lots of examples of this, giving with the one hand, taking with the other, like schools that try to create a sense of community. They do constructive conflict resolution, but then they undercut those efforts by refusing to give up punitive interventions like timeouts and detentions and suspensions. Or schools that avoid punishment because they know that makes no sense, but then they negate that by continuing to use reward systems and praise, or one hand offers a thoughtful curriculum and the other hand uses tests to evaluate students' progress. Well, you get the idea. Anyway, where was I? There was this second group of people commenting on my remarks about cold calling are asking, is it always objectionable? And my response and their response is basically, it depends how it's done and it depends why it's done. The third group of people reacting to this, we're kind of digging deeper into the purposes of cold calling and wondering about the alternatives. Like, several people seem troubled by the idea that we just always wait for kids to volunteer and tell us when they're ready. One person was concerned that waiting for them to raise their hands means you're going to hear only from like 20% of the kids in what's supposed to be a whole class discussion. Well, that's right. That's a good point. We don't want to exclude shy kids. We don't want to leave out introverts. We don't want to let a few kids dominate the discussion. Again, talking here about real discussions, not about pimping kids out to bark out answers. But the choice not to talk should be respected. So the problem with raising hands, where many kids won't, shouldn't lead us to the equally flawed option of cold calling, nor should the problems of cold calling lead us just to wait for kids to raise their hand. We should avoid the approach that says, you have to talk when I tell you to, and we should avoid, you may talk only when I tell you to. Those two actually aren't opposites. They're complementary. And the main reason to reject the latter, you may talk only when I tell you to, isn't that too few kids will volunteer. It's that the class remains too teacher-centered rather than student-centered. Exactly the same as with cold calling. So the response is neither of those options, I think. It's to develop with the kids, not just for the kids, a model of discussion that encourages everybody to speak up when they're ready without forcing anyone to do so. It's a way of supporting a sense of community in the classroom and becoming self-governing, as opposed to investing in one person, the teacher, the sole authority to decide who talks when. So if we bring kids in on the process of deciding how we can all feel safer to contribute, and then we individually as students make the decision of when we're ready to do that, that's really powerful. There's, I think, a moral argument for rejecting hand-raising and cold calling, but it provides additional advantages besides the fact that it's the right thing to do. It helps fashion social skills. It helps build kids who figure out how they can create a kind of interactive environment that's respectful and effective. That's what happens when the kids have the collective responsibility of coming up with some third alternative to the two traditional models. Plus, it signals the trust that the teacher has in the kids and the respect that the teacher has for them. So there's a little piece of video about a classroom that did this that is a must-watch. And at least at this recording, it's still up on YouTube. The show notes for this episode will have the link for it. But in case you don't have time or it disappears or you can't watch it for some reason, I'm going to very briefly describe what happens in this Kentucky elementary school classroom that's on the video. So the teacher starts out, this is a real teacher, she starts out the year brainstorming features of what kind of classroom do we want to have? And one kid eventually says, we should raise our hands instead of yelling out. Now, that's pretty common. The amazing thing is how this teacher reacts. She doesn't just happily, check off this item on her mental list of rules I hoped they would suggest and move on. Instead, she pauses and gently challenges this idea. We should raise our hands instead of... She wonders out loud whether raising hands is really necessary. Are there other ways to avoid having everybody talk at once? Ways that don't give me all the power. And the kids aren't biting. They're kind of disconcerted by any scenario other than the one they've been carefully trained to accept for years. So she reads the room, she backs off. But later in the year, she invites them to revisit this question. And now most of the kids are more comfortable. And they're ready to try out a more democratic model of discussion. And we watch them come to this conclusion. And then the end of the video is this little epilogue where we, on another day, watch the kids engaging in a discussion of a story they've just read, politely taking turns while the teacher listens and does not call on anyone. Really powerful for people who have literally never considered the option, including wonderful, skilled, caring, experienced teachers at all age levels it's literally never dawned on them that there is a better way to have a classroom discussion than the teacher calling on people who have to wait and raise their hands. Putting aside here the cold calling option to deal with another issue. So ideally, moving beyond raising your hands or cold calling is part of an ongoing larger project that a teacher has to create a caring classroom community that has a strong element of democracy, where the kids are helped to feel a sense of belonging, and they're given continuous opportunities to make decisions. This typically happens during regularly scheduled class meetings, where kids are invited to propose concrete, useful ideas to make self-governing discussions run smoothly and fairly. And if they try it and it doesn't work out so well, if people are talking at once, or if some people aren't talking at all, then that doesn't mean democracy failed. It means we return to a democratic decision-making forum to figure out together how to solve the problem. And the benefits kids derive from this multi-stage process may be deeper and more long-lasting than any of the aspects of the curriculum that they're learning. And again, all of that learning is lost when kids never even have the opportunity to decide, how are we going to do this? What is really powerful to watch this brainstorming. How can everybody in here feel free to offer opinions and ask questions? Well, maybe the teacher can approach certain kids individually who are not saying anything and gently asking them why, to make sure they're not being quiet because they fear that other people will make fun of them for what they say. Asking the kid, would you feel open to gentle invitations to contribute. Would that be okay with you? Students can have the chance to reflect on the benefit of regular opportunities to talk in pairs and small groups. In other words, questioning the idea that we have to spend the whole time in a whole class discussion, really challenging the whole premise of the conversation about this, about how we decide stuff. Two researchers I know like to say no one gets left out of a pair. So for the shy kids, the solution is not, I'm going to drag you into a conversation that you don't want to engage in, nor is it just to leave you on your own when you're feeling intimidated by everybody else in the classroom judging possibly your comment. You're going to change the structure that retains the democratic community feel by having some of the time have kids just talk one-on-one, and then maybe, or maybe not, report out what they said in their pairs to the whole group, which now feels a little safer for the kids who are a little more introverted. To bring kids in on this is respectful, and it also promotes social and moral and intellectual development. And practically speaking, it also produces more good ideas, just because there are more of them than there are teachers in the room. Any individual, even the teacher, can come up with only so many ideas. But when you have more heads, you're more likely to come up with good ideas. And as the year goes on, kids may start to join the teacher in extending those gentle invitations to quiet peers. Randy, were you going to say something just now? But teachers should be challenging themselves as well, as with any process. Avoiding cold calling and hand raising contributes not just to a democratic community, it also has the possibility of improving the pedagogy, the teaching itself. Most discussions about cold calling tend to focus on how do we elicit the students' responses to a teacher's question, right? Do we force them to answer or whatever? But again, take a step back. Why is the teacher asking most of the questions? The kids' willingness to speak and the quality of their learning are both enhanced if most of the questions that shape the curriculum are the kids' questions. And so once again, as we saw with homework and with so many other topics, we start as an entryway into thinking about education through a very narrow, specific issue. In this case, how to decide who talks when. And next thing you know, you're asking big questions about how learning happens and what's the point of it. And in this case, whose questions drive the curriculum. Also, in looking at this issue, the teacher may start to think about assessment. Grades, as you've heard me say, are bad enough, but you should never, ever grade class participation, which completely kills the authenticity of any discussion. It destroys kids' any possibility of developing a meaningful interest in whatever you're talking about. Grades poison everything they touch. And if you start grading kids for their participation in discussions, so much for the value of those discussions. It undermines the whole classroom dynamic. So, self-governing conversations, maybe you're thinking, that's a tall order, especially for very young children and especially in very large classrooms. Very large classes tend to be more about listening than learning. So, you may not be able to do all of this in all classrooms all the time. It may require adjustments and compromises, but the general rule is you treat students with respect, which means you neither compel them to speak, nor do you reserve for yourself the unilateral right to decide who gets to speak. That's morally appropriate, I think. It's educationally beneficial. And practically speaking, it's very realistic and helpful. What matters is that we're willing to give up some control.